What years did you serve as the Privacy Commissioner of Canada?
Between 2014 and 2022.
So were you surprised yesterday during the testimony by the RCMP and Minister Medicino that the on-device investigative tool for hacking into our cell phones has predated your time as Privacy Commissioner, and they never once consulted you or asked about, the privacy impact of using this on our devices?
I was surprised by the tool itself and how intrusive it is, and that it was used for so long. Certainly, there have been many discussions over the years, and as the RCMP said yesterday, probably since the early 2000s, on the lawful access issue, and both in my term as commissioner and when I was at the Department of Justice, I was following and part of these discussions. But the use of this particular tool to go around encryption, yes, was a surprise.
So yesterday we were talking about the order paper question that came back, and in the order paper question it actually said that the RCMP had consulted with you as Privacy Commissioner, or with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, about the use of ODIT, which we now know never happened. But how did you interpret that response in the OPQ versus their actual testimony?
The comment that we were consulted most likely related to some other related initiative, but not the use of this particular technology.
Yesterday, an RCMP officer said something that I was wondering about. It was the use or potential surveillance by foreign companies on Canadian citizens. As a Privacy Commissioner, were you aware of any such practices? I didn't have any proof, but I did have some question, some doubt as to whether, a reasonable doubt as to whether or not it was occurring. Right now, are there any provisions that would stop any foreign powers to use surveillance in Canada? I think it's a question of national security and measures taken by national security agencies to stop any kind of illegal activity. Thank you.
During your time as a Privacy Commissioner, could you comment on the rate at which ministries and agencies under the Privacy Act have proactively presented policies and measures for outcomes and accountability within their departmental plans and reporting back to public accounts or to your office that you felt kept pace with technology as it is today?
That's an excellent question. During my term, I would say that Treasury Board, as a matter of priority, because of limited resources probably, spent more time on access to information questions than privacy questions. Not that they were absent from the privacy landscape, but they certainly gave priority to access to information. There was an access to information bill presented, etc. The long and short of it is that there was not an absence of activity, but there was not a whole lot of activity.
So it's safe to say that even though in spirit, the policy of the Treasury Board directing all agencies to enact enhanced protections under the Privacy Act didn't necessarily result in proactive new policies that are in keeping with the pace of technology today. Is that safe to say?
Yes, although I will say that in the recent year or so, there have been interesting developments. So a policy on artificial intelligence, for instance. But over the term of my term, there was not a whole lot of activity. More progress recently.
And in the time of your term, how much of that activity in proactive improvement and self-reflection and auditing came from law enforcement and public security agencies with specificity around the RCMP? Was the RCMP leading the way in improving their processes around privacy?
No.
Okay.
If we look at facial recognition and the creation of what they call NTOPs, it was at our request. It was not proactive on their part.
Sure, and is it also safe to say that in some of your dealings, and I hope we could be candid here, that maybe they weren't always forthcoming with the information as necessary for you to be able to fulfill the duties of your work in a timely manner?
I think they function within the law as it is.
That is an important distinction, because what's before us today isn't necessarily a positioning of the RCMP as being rogue or going outside the confines of law, but it's the gaps, I would argue. And in fact, Deputy Commissioner Larkin in his testimony suggested there was gaps in legislation. So would you also then agree that even though what is currently legal, and I think we've established is quite outdated, might not necessarily be ethical given the way in which technology has outpaced legislation?
Whether it's ethical or not, there are certainly improvements that are possible given the intrusiveness of the technology beyond Part 6 of the Criminal Code, yes.
And, you know, I think that there'd be a long debate on the ethics of it, but I would put to the committee that if we have technology that goes beyond the spirit of existing legislation, is known to be such, is then in some instances, whether it's Stingray or the Operation Wide Awake, which was a social media surveillance or others, that if they're not proactively disclosing these things, then it doesn't give legislators the opportunity to keep up with it. And I think that's the spirit of what's before us here today. So I referenced the European Convention on Human Rights that established transparency, accountability, privacy by design, and data protective impact assessments. That's a relatively modern piece of legislation. In your mind, how does Canada compare to that?
We, by and large, have policies, not always respected, that have a similar spirit, but there are not legal requirements. And I think it would be extremely helpful to change these policy rules into laws so that the likelihood that they would actually be implemented would increase significantly.
What I'm hearing today, and we can get into distinctions between whether or not it's prescriptive or non-prescriptive or whether or not it's preamble, I'm a firm believer that if we don't direct law enforcement to improve and increase their transparency and to provide clear measures of accountability and privacy by design, it won't happen. Would you agree with that? That
Yes.
if we don't provide those guidelines, it just won't happen?
Yes, and further, I think it is possible to have these requirements at a sufficient level of generality but still meaningful without being overly prescriptive and preventing officials, whether by the police or others, from exercising judgment. But
Thank you.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.